we'll say thank you so much for joining the session on a Monday afternoon or Monday morning, depending on where you're sitting right now, for I believe it's the fourth or fifth session of our Readiness Monthly series, which we started in March, part of the initiative of J Response, which most of you, perhaps all of you, but most of you I know have been through our Hineni J Response training. We're currently running one right now. And this was a session that was invited for those who have completed and all JCC professionals that were interested in our readiness conversations. Um, we had a few in the spring and then took off for the summer, and then it was high holidays. So we're kind of renewing the first of three for the fall. We're going to have a session with some outside speakers in November and December. And I took the session for October because as we the Ready model includes how we best train our team, and we haven't yet had the formal conversation with J responders and J response of what's the best way of going about training? What are the tricks of the trade to understand how we can best train our team? I want to give a shout out to Leah Garber, who I know is joining us in a little bit. She and I really direct and vision out this readiness series, and I want to express gratitude to her, and I'll express more gratitude to her when she comes on. All right, we got a critical mass. I'm going to share my screen. Don't worry, you won't be hearing from me the whole time. We'll be hearing from you too, in fact, really soon. I'm not going to see all of your faces all at once right now because you're going to be seeing this screen in front of you. Our monthly readiness series resumes today, Monday, October 18th, 2021, preparing to respond and specifically training your team. This will be a familiar slide from those that have attended our trainings in the past. Make sure your tech is good to go. If you are ready for this training, you can hear me, you can see me, you're all set, and take that moment to do that if you haven't already. I'm encouraging you to remove your distractions. Many of you, if not most of you, are at a JCC right now with a lot of other things going on. Should an emergency come up, of course, go and tend to it. We are, after all, J Response. But if you're able to be fully present for the session and remove any other distractions as best you can, that would be great. Take this moment. I'm already standing because that's how I like to teach, whether I'm in person or virtually. But if you haven't yet stood in the last couple of hours or taken a deep breath or centering yourself, I invite you to do that right now. And then again, if you haven't already, rename yourself with your name, agency, and pronouns so we can all know who else is in the room. Not all of us have been in the same J response cohorts or conversations. Okay, so an opening ritual. I am going to ask you about how we best train our team before I share with you my tips and strategies to present to you on training your team. I want you to think about all the times you've been in a training experience. It does not necessarily have to be training in preparation for, an impending disaster or, a fire drill or, a functional simulation of that kind. It could be any training on anything. It could be any learning experience on anything. But I want you to think about what's been your best and why. What elements of that training experience made it so great, made it fulfill the goals that you thought you had of it, that you thought were the goals of the training, made the learning stick. And I'd like you to share it in the chat. You can share, in a half a sentence, I went to this training and it was great because X. I'd like you to take a minute, think about it. When you have something, write it in the chat. Okay, great. Hands-on simulations. You can go straight to the why of why it was great, or why you think it fulfilled the goals of it, or why you thought it was engaging. Let's give yourself a few seconds, and I want you to put some in the chat. Setups, expectations early on. Thank you, Natalie. Any training that has hands-on component and opportunity to work with others, that's how I learned best. The trainer being an expert and setting it up in advance. Small group practical outcomes. Learning by doing. Great, we're going to talk a little bit about that shortly. Keep them coming. There's a lot of wisdom in this room, and what I love about teaching, especially teaching in kind of an experiential frame, is that I may have some things to share, but really the wisdom of how to best create an amazing training can come from each other. So keep putting them in the chat. I'm going to put you into breakouts, well-organized trainings, training where every group and activity was exceedingly interesting. Great. And creating lasting bonds with other trainees. Great to bring up relationships. I'm going to put you into breakout groups. They're going to be small. This is an opportunity, as these virtual experiences are, to get to know other J responders, get to know other people in JCCs. And I want you to share in breakout groups a little bit more about the best training that you've been to and why it was so great. And also just share who you are, what you do at your JCC, your previous connection to JResponse if you have. And then we'll share back before we get into the formal presentation. So I'm going to set up those breakout rooms. We have, I'll put about 3 to 4 in the room, um, and we'll take about 8 minutes or so, maybe a little bit less than that, 6 minutes or so to chat before we get into the formal presentation. So I'm going to create the rooms and see you in about 6 minutes. Awesome. Hi, Leah, and hi, Brooke. See if Brooke is on. Brooke is still connecting to audio. Leah,
Hi,
we're
Mark. Sorry for being late. I was in another meeting.
no worries. We just went into the opening ritual breakout,
Great.
which is
Sorry.
what makes for a great training experience. And there's some stuff in the chat that I can.
Okay. Thanks. Sorry.
No worries. Here, I'll post. This is when I asked them what their favorite, what was so great about a training they went to. These were some of the responses, just so you can see.
Thank you.
Yeah, Brooke, if you're on, and you're, oh, and here's Rebecca. You know what? Maybe I'll just make this a group. So I'll have to put her where she's in the waiting room. How do I get to the waiting room? What time is it? It is 1:09 participants. Let's get back in. Hi, Rebecca. Let me just pause the recording now that I realize that we're still recording. Pause to do. Awesome. And then we have about, I think everyone is still in their breakout rooms. We have, oh, is everyone back? I think everyone's back now. Awesome. So does anyone want to share out loud? Rebecca from Kaplan JCC and Jesse in Newport News, we were in a group with them. We're sharing a little bit about what makes for an amazing training experience. You put some in the chat. I want to open it up. Does anybody, let me actually stop sharing my screen for a second so we can all see each other. Does anybody want to share one thing that comes up of like what they shared in their breakout group of just what makes a training sticky, engaging, fun, amazing that they want to share out loud before we get into the meat of the matter?
Since everybody's talking at once, I'll go. Hi, Mark. I think one thing that kind of stood out, well, it was funny because we all had backgrounds in education, and I'm still in that, but other people are doing other things that started there. So talk, humor is really important, and learning by doing, but also keeping in mind that not everybody else learns best that way. So making sure that you check in to see how other people need to have things presented to them so that they have the opportunity to learn in the best way that they can. But that also, we also got into talking about at the end, having the opportunity to debrief and to get feedback to make sure that you are meeting the needs of the group. I missed anything, Sarah or Natalie? Just something.
Anybody else? Thank you so much, Sherry. We're going to be hearing some of those things in some of those tools and tips in just a moment, more of them. Any other responses that people want to lift up?
Yeah, I think that Blair and I were talking, and seemed like the thing that we both really agreed on was just the passion for the training itself, about the information that we were learning about. And whenever we had a training that meant a lot to us, that's when we got stuff out of it.
Engaging content that is meaningful to the attendees. Awesome. Feel free to keep them coming in the chat. I'm going to share my screen again. And now that we have some senses from each other of what goes into a great training, what I'd like to do is review a little bit about our readiness model, just a little bit to frame how we then think about the 10 tools and tips that I will present to you. So as you put your trainings together for your staff and with your teams, what did you incorporate so you reach these goals? And we're going to talk about goals as well in this training. So even though a lot of the strategies that I'll present to you are based on modes of experiential learning, for the next little bit, this will be a tad more frontal, just so we can get the information out, but I'll try to be as entertaining and dynamic as possible. I'm told I'm halfway decent at that, so let's go for it. So reminder for all of us, you all passed the J-Response assessment, and if you haven't, feel free to take Hineni training so you can become an official J-Responder. J-Response is our 4 R's. We bold readiness here, but as you can imagine, the more ready we are, the more resilient we will be individually and as an organization, and better positioned to provide relief and recovery. We're going to talk a little bit about what it means to address the why of these trainings, something that you should talk about in your training. If you're doing a fire drill, if you're doing a tabletop exercise, which we'll talk about, you should put this in your training. Talk about the virtuous cycle of J-Response and how readiness really incorporates and supports the other R's of this important work. And again, our philosophy is that the best and perhaps most important form of response is preparation or readiness. This was also from the modules in Hineni that we have called our READY model: relationships, emergency plan, assessment, document, and your team. This is really the focus on the why, both the WHY, which we'll talk about, and the Y, the letter Y, that we are doing this together as a team, and that's why we do these trainings, and that is a huge component of readiness. So something also that you can stress in your trainings as well. 2 major slides that were in the readiness part of Hineni, we talked a lot about situational and awareness, both in training, how you think about the perception of the elements in your environment before a crisis is coming, and then once a crisis is hit, how do we then comprehend and how do we then project future events? You can put this in your training as well. A lot of the training that you do is really about level 1. Is it about putting everything in place so you can have the perception of the elements in the environment and you have the tools handy that when an event is occurring or about to occur or has occurred, you know where the emergency plans are, you know how to assess, you know what the drill is. So this is really all on the level of level 1 situational awareness, so we can then be prepared to go into level 2 and level 3. That's part of the why of this training as well. And what we talked about in Hineni training, which we'll expand upon now, is that it could the what could look different, right? It could be a tabletop exercise, an informal conversation, which I'll expand on shortly. It can be a functional simulation, simulating an emergency or practicing a role, and then reflecting on it. And then really the full-scale drill, which most people are most familiar with, coming into J-Response, because many of us, most of us, all of us went to school and had those fire drills and had those other drills. And wouldn't you know it, there hasn't been a death because of a fire at a school, to my understanding, in many, many years since they operated full-scale drills. So these readiness work, this training work does its job. So this is what we've done before. This is how we should practice, but I think it's important for us as J-Responders charged to train our teams to be clear with ourselves, with our leadership, and with our staff. What are our goals of a training? It's not just be prepared for crisis. That's too broad. How do we drill down on what those goals are? So know your goals. This is an educational philosophy, and we'll touch on a lot of educational philosophies in these next few minutes. One is KDBB. What do we want our peers, anyone that's in our training, to know, to do, to believe, and to belong to. And to expand on that, we want them to know what to do, if someone needs to call 911, right? We want them to know that knowledge, and they want to be able to do that knowledge, or to do that strategy, or to do that step as well. We also want them to believe that what they're doing is the right thing to be doing. And perhaps a larger goal for all this training, we don't want them to be passive and to be like, okay, this is the training that I'm sitting in, but I'm not really paying attention. To no, I belong, I'm a part of this team that's supposed to execute and supposed to even design some of our readiness plans as well. So you can think about KDBB. And as many of you said in our opening ritual, building relationships and challenging conventions, being able to connect with other people and having meaningful conversations that either amplifies the correct idea or challenges ideas that they may have that we don't want them necessarily to have in thinking about readiness and training and what to do for a crisis. That's why we're doing this work. And that's, if we have these goals, having those goals really front of mind will allow us to then design trainings to meet the goals that we are. And of course, we want to make sure the learning sticks. We don't want them to just hear it, sign a form, and walk away. We want them to really engage in the experience, so then they know what to do at the time of the event, and that the learning really does stick. So we think about goals. Now we're going to get into the 10 tips of awesome team training. These are 10 tips that are not necessarily exclusive to training around crisis preparation or disaster response preparation, but we're employing them here because I think they're just really good tips that will allow you to run trainings that meet the goals that we just talked about. So here are the 10, and they might feel familiar because we have a lot of wise people on this call that were already sharing some of these as well, so allow me to amplify. 1 is to have an opening ritual. I'll be talking about each. 2 is to make use of, in Hebrew, chavruta, or partner chat, partner discussions. 3, which expands on it, give them something to do, not just to listen. Address the why we're here, why we're doing this. Incorporate personal stories. Engage in team projects. Lead with appreciative inquiry, and we'll define that in a bit. Invite reflection. Commit to following up. And a closing ritual. So I'm going to take probably the next 10 plus minutes to go through each. And at the end, we'll ask you what's resonating with you, what's challenging you, and what other questions that you have. So like next 10 to 12 minutes, you'll be listening to me a little bit more, and then we'll invite everyone in this conversation to have a group dialogue about these tips, to share again what's resonating, what's challenging you, what questions do you have. Okay, so a little bit about each, and then you can go back and say, what do I want to incorporate in my trainings the next time we're doing a simulation or a tabletop exercise or updating an emergency plan at our JCC. So, opening rituals. Well, we just did one, so there's a nice reflection. You can call it an icebreaker. It doesn't necessarily have to be a get-to-know-you activity, but it could. What goes into a good opening ritual? 1, to make sure that the instructions are clear, that what you're asking people to do is clear to them. So it may even be good to share with a few people, this is my opening ritual for the training, this is what I'm asking people to do, is that clear, before you actually do it, so you know that it's clear. 2, in a way that everyone feels included. 3, that it is easy access, that in the opening ritual, are we defining, are we sharing terms, are we asking people to do things that doesn't allow people to engage, where they don't know that knowledge, or they don't have the physical ability or mental emotional ability to engage in the ritual. We want to make sure that everyone can do it. Number 2 and number 3 are very similar that way, or the second and the third dash. 4 doesn't last very long. Sometimes you can do an opening ritual that takes 20 minutes, you only had an hour, and then you're rushing through the training. Make it concise, because it accomplishes your goal of building a community, and then you have plenty of time to go into the meat of the matter. And energizes the participants, gets their heart moving, gets their mind stimulated in a meaningful way, so then they're really ready to learn. And it's okay to be a little corny. Be authentic to you, but as someone who was trained in the army of JCC camp counseloring, you learned a lot of perhaps corny, perhaps cheesy, engaging tricks with your campers and your staff. Those work with adults too. If it doesn't feel right to you, I'm not pushing it, but draw from that well of resource. And if you want some ideas of those, happy to drill down on that with you afterwards. Okay, so what's an example? What we just did earlier was an example. Going into breakout groups and asking for an opening question, or even at the very beginning, breathing, stretching, and centering yourself, doing something communal that allows us to set the stage for success for the hour. So it could be a collective deep breath or stretching. It could be creating and chanting a group cheer. You know, we are the Meyerson JCC J responders, and we're gonna, you know where I'm going. Again, might be a little cheesy, but it gets people to feel a part of it and not just a passive learner. Everyone shares one good thing that happened to them that day, especially if they're walking in and they're not feeling so hot for whatever reason. You're giving them a chance to smile, you're giving them a chance to improve their mood, will then make them more focused on the learning. Doesn't always have to be an icebreaker, again. So that's one, have an opening ritual, right? You hear me say this in trainings a lot. If you remember nothing else, remember this. If you have an opening ritual that really sets the stage, you're already in a better place for people to feel like they belong here, to people to feel like this matters to them, to people to feel like the learning will stick, no matter what you do next, although what you do next is also important. Number two, use of Havruta. So what is Havruta? It's partner work or debate. In Jewish tradition, where there's a lot of studying of ancient Jewish texts, and when you think about an emergency plan, when you think about a drill plan, those are texts, those are, you know, documents of instructions or of policies that we have to go over and debate and discuss as part of certain trainings. They may not be holy texts in the way that we think of religious texts, but they're important texts that can save lives. Give people a chance to read it and to engage with it for themselves and discuss it. You don't just have to present it to them and allow them to, you know, read it on their own time. Have that debate of like, is this the right policy we should have? What works with this policy? You've worked at this JCC for 5 years. What might you change for this policy? And have the partner conversation so everyone feels involved. Another great thing about Havruta is that if you have a group of 20 people, you know, you want everyone involved, but you might not be able to hear from every single person in that group because you have an agenda. But if you have everyone speak to each other, then they are all speaking and sharing their voice. Without having to call on everyone, even if they're only speaking to one, or if it's a small group, 2 or 3 other people. So you can ask example, what areas of our JCC do we feel need a separate emergency response plan? If you're looking at your general one and you think, well, the one for early childhood or the one for seniors or the one for people with a host of different needs need a different emergency response plan. Have that as a discussion. Have that as a Havruta chat. Gets people involved, gets people engaged in the topic matter. Again, the benefits. Everyone gets to speak, developing relationships. Folks get to share and teach each other. It's not just frontal learning. Allows for learning from different perspectives as well, and allows for identifying gaps and fixing them before they become a problem. The more people that are allowed to speak up and speak out, the more that you may be able to identify from someone's different perspective something that needs to be changed. That person may not always feel that they are able to just raise their hand in front of 20 people or walk into the senior director to give them a suggestion. Havruta kind of alleviates those barriers. And it also helps for the learning to stick because they're more engaged. Okay, number 3. We heard this already in the opening ritual. Give people something to do. This is from the world of experiential education, and if you know anything about John Dewey, you may have know Dewey from the Dewey Decimal System in libraries, but he was also an exceptional educational visionary and philosophy, a philosopher of education. He said, give the pupils something to do, not something to learn. And if the doing is of such a nature as to demand thinking, learning naturally exists. So if you need to train people on how to, engage, how to call 911 if there's an emergency, is there a way to simulate actually them calling 911 and just giving them instructions? Obviously, you don't want to call 911 unless you have an actual emergency, but if there's a way to engage with the people that work there and do a simulation, is an example. This is why we do drills as well. Also, coming up with policies and coming up with protocols, giving them something to do and not just to listen to, that's when things will stick. You may have seen this cycle before if you've been engaged in all educational discussions. It's often called the cold learning cycle. It talks about the way of learning through experiencing and then reflecting, going from red to yellow. That stimulates thinking, and then that stimulates acting. So I've experienced And we do this in J-response training. I've experienced what it is like to engage with someone who has dealt with trauma. And I've practiced what it means to speak to somebody and to say, I'm here for you, what do you need, instead of I know how you feel. Then I reflect on that. And we're going to talk more about reflection in a moment. That will stimulate thinking, which will allow for the learning to stick, and then I can act on that. That is a very potent way of training people to understand policies, procedures, and to act in certain ways than simply just listening. And I realize I'm being a bit contradictory right now because I'm just listening to what I'm saying, but that's why we did the opening ritual before, and I want you to think about these tools as you engage in the training plans at your JCC. So give them something to do. An example of that is the tabletop exercise. And let's define that again. Tabletop exercises are discussion-based sessions where team members meet in an informal classroom or courtyard setting to discuss their roles during an emergency and their responses to a particular emergency situation, whether it's an immediate emergency or something that's also a long-term crisis as well. And then you, as the facilitator, can guide participants through a discussion of one or more scenarios. So an example of that would be the JCC closed after a massive hurricane warning. And after the hurricane, there was major damage to the facility, and it is unclear how our staff and members are. What are our steps to ensure safety and provide help? You can put people into different groups to engage in the exercise. Don't give them the policy yet. Don't tell them what to do. Say, you're in charge, you're the CEO, or you're the head of facilities, you are whatever the position is. How are we going to make sure our staff are safe? How are we sure we're going to know they're safe now, and how are we going to make sure that they get safe back to the JCC? Let them come up with the policy. Let them experience what it would mean to actually enact the policy. Share ideas, then provide feedback to each other. That would be the reflection. Through that exercise and that reflection stimulates learning, and then we can implement those ideas or refine the policy, and that's the acting. So you can think about how you might want to do that when you go about trainings at your JCC, especially around readiness. All right, 134, we're moving on our way. Addressing the why. So we have a why of J response. This comes from the why of Sum and Seneca. It's not just the what we do and how we do it, it's why we're doing it. In our trainings, I can't tell you how many trainings that I've been to, both response, readiness trainings, and otherwise, where they don't really stress why we're here, other than the basic of where we're here because we want to be ready when a crisis hits. But go deeper into that. Let's talk about that an optimally ready, and this is from earlier trainings that you've been to, an optimally ready organization does not necessarily know the exact nature of the crisis that will befall it, yet we can anticipate possible crises and prepare to respond. And if we're here and we're doing this work, then we're going to be in a better situation once the crisis hits or once that threat becomes a reality. And you can use this slide, and you will all get this PowerPoint, when you are addressing the why in your trainings. It improves our situational awareness, who you want to define that for whoever you're training with, mitigates its ultimate effects, helps aid in a recovery phase, expands our knowledge, strengthens both our communities and our collective resilience. We're here to do important work that will save lives and save livelihoods. That will, I'm going to imagine, get more people to pay more attention and to engage more than if you didn't address the why. So, example, why are we talking about documentation? And you can put that in the chat if you want to know why we're talking about documentation, if we want to exemplify this. What I want to address in this slide is that you don't always just have to give the answer. As I did at the beginning of this training, I could have gone straight into the top 10 tips, but I wanted to hear from you first because the wisdom in the room might not only have great answers, but then they're already more engaged in the process. They understand already, they own the answer, and you can just then verify it. Great. If you want to put why we would talk about documentation in readiness trainings or in J-response, by all means, I'm going to move forward because I want to respect your times, and I also have some Q&A and discussion at the end, but that's just an example of how you can address the why by not just stating it, by asking it, and let people share why. Number 5, use personal stories. Personal stories, they bring the real to the technical. If you have someone come and speak about the experience that they had during Hurricane Sandy or during Hurricane Harvey, and how what happened at the JCC or what happened in their flooded home, It brings the real to the technical. So much of this readiness training that we do is very technical, right? This is the phone number that you need to call. This is the place where you need to hide. This is the, what you need to do in an active shooter training. But if you have real stories, then it further addresses the why, and it really makes it powerful, and it gives people even more of a reason to be engaged and to be, in a matter of speaking, excited about the work that we're doing. It brings it home. And again, it's another story, it's another experience that we may be hearing it vicariously, but it's an opportunity to learn from that experience as well. There are several articles out there, and I'm happy to send it as a post, that Joel Dinkin in Houston, the CEO in Houston, has written about. David Sorkin, who is the former CEO of the JCC in Staten Island, wrote about that their experiences, their personal stories from Sandy and from Harvey respectively, actually helped their JCC prepare and best respond to COVID. There were some similarities out there that allowed them to have the relationships that they needed, updated their emergency plans, strengthen their communications, engage differently with their staff, that put them in a quote unquote better place because they were able to learn from their experiences and their personal stories. And how do you do that? You can say, have someone come in, whether you are, close to somebody that's experienced this crisis that is willing to share, or virtual someone in, say, during Hurricane Sandy, we did this, or during this crisis, we did that, or this is how we felt, depending on the specific topic of your training. But using personal stories is helpful. 6, work in teams, and this is kind of a little bit different than Chavruta. Chavruta is usually meant to be a partner in a debate, but putting people in a team project. Maybe there's 4 teams that's working on a tabletop exercise, or you have 4 different exercises that you're doing with teams to, each engage in a different readiness matter. Why are teams great? They foster collaboration. They offer different ideas and allow for different perspectives to come in. And it also builds trust. We want to trust, build trust and have trust with everyone that we're navigating and working with, especially during times of crisis. So promote teamwork in your trainings. Number 7, lead with appreciative inquiry. I'm at number 7, I'm close to number 10, and then we'll have some time to chat. Appreciative inquiry. What is appreciative inquiry? Appreciative inquiry, which is also called 4D cycle, appreciative inquiry, has 4 stages. And I just watched Ted Lasso, the first 2 seasons of it, so he's all about appreciating and about questioning and about curiosity. This is leading with curiosity. There's 4 phases of appreciative inquiry, which invites people to be curious and to ask inquiring questions about what we're learning. 1 is discovery. Inquire into the best of the past and the present. Choose the positive as the focus of the inquiry, what has worked in the past, and I'll appropriate this to J response and readiness training in a moment. 2 is the dream phase. Use the findings and stories from the discovery phase to create a compelling, memorable, and ambitious picture of the desired future. Locate themes that appear in stories and select topics for further inquiry. 3, design. Create shared images of a preferred future. Determine what should be. And number 4, destiny. Determine what will be. Find innovative ways to create that future. So how would we use appreciative inquiry in readiness? So how might we design a better emergency response plan? That could be the question. That could be the appreciative inquiry. You can use the discovery phase to say, okay, let's learn what's in place now. What works now and what doesn't? Let's go through our emergency response plan. Let's act it out, maybe in a tabletop exercises, talk it out and say, okay, let's discover what's working and let's discover what may not make sense because it was written in 2005 before we have the tools that, the communications tools that we have now, before WhatsApp, before Signal, before, the social media or the technical media that we have today. And, many of our institutions may have emergency response plans that are older than they should be. Dream. What should it look like? What's the shared dream? So now that we've discovered, based on the past and the present, what would be the ideal scenario? Obviously, no one gets hurt, everyone is safe, depending on the nature of the crisis that we're examining. But let's dream, let's vision for the best possible solution, the best possible plan. Then we design it. We have the dream, we know from the past, let's design it, let's make it happen, and let's be positive and open and curious about every idea. And then we go to our destiny and innovate to get there. Then we actually practice our design, we try to make it happen, and then we innovate and we reflect on, is this working or is this not? What's important about appreciative inquiry is that it's always focused on the positive. It's always focused on building ideas, kind of on an improv model, and not necessarily striking down an idea if it's wrong, because many times we realize that ideas can work if we work through it. So number 7, appreciative inquiry. It's a little more of a complicated of the 10 tips, but often works well in engaging team training. Many of you talked about this already, the use of reflection, also a quote from John Dewey, one of my favorites. We don't learn from experiences, we learn from reflecting on the experience. If we go through a 1-hour training on what we do, if there is a crisis situation, if there's a security situation, and we don't have an opportunity to ask people questions, to dialogue on it, to reflect on it, then they were not going to learn as much as you want them to learn, if they learn at all. The experiences end, but reflecting on the experiences allow us to learn, and that can happen in that hour or after that hour, 1 minute to 1 year or many years after that hour. So then how do you reflect? How do you have your staff look back, examine, in order to move forward? Well, it can be some of the tools that we've already talked about. It can be in Chavruta. They can write, what have you learned from this training, and they can journal about it. You can give them an opportunity to draw what they've learned, depending on the nature of the training. That actually may be very helpful, like draw out what we would do. Use appreciative inquiry. Think, pair, share, which is sort of what we did before. Have that partner conversation, have them write down their ideas, partner, and then share out in the big group. And then there's the taking the temperature exercise, like if you feel this way, stand to the left. If you feel this way, stand to the right. If you feel really prepared, stand to the left. If you don't feel really prepared, stand to the right. What will you do in this situation? Go to that corner, go to that corner, etc. And happy to go into detail on those type of tools and tips with you. But the important thing is to incorporate reflection in all of your trainings. Some of these are example prompts. What did this experience teach you about preparation? What inspired you or challenged you? I'll be asking these questions in a moment to you based on this hour. How would you have done the stipulation or tabletop exercise or drill differently? Number 9 and number 10. Number 9 is to commit to following up. Promise me, promise me, promise me that if you are learning and leading a training at your JCC, that it is not a one-off and that there are opportunities to check in and follow up on the training with the people that you're engaging with. Should not be a one-off. How can this connect to a future conversation? Whether you have another training scheduled or in your upcoming department or staff meetings, we say, remember that training that we did a few weeks ago, how are you thinking about that now? And what can we do to really enact the things that we learned? Create accountability. Make sure the training has some kind of homework. Maybe it's connected to people's performance reviews in terms of the projects that they're working on and checking in on that. And performance review may not necessarily be like the annual evaluation, but it could be just the supervision or the other type of managerial meetings and check-ins that you may have at your J. And maybe a tabletop exercise, what we might do in this situation and talk it out could lead to a functional simulation of it, could lead to a full-scale drill of it. They kind of build on each other as well. The last thing, we talked about an opening ritual, builds relationships, creates community, gets people ready for learning. So does a closing ritual. And the closing ritual, here are some good components of it. You'll see these are familiar to the opening ritual. Clear instructions, everyone feels included, easy access, doesn't last very long, allows the learning to stick, right? That's that one opportunity before they leave the classroom or the courtyard, or wherever you're doing the training, to really make that learning stick, give them that one last great experience, connect to everything that they've learned. It also energizes the participants at the end, just like the beginning. It invites for further reflection. It also invites a call to action. So we've done this hour, or this 90 minutes, or this day. What next? What are we going to do? How can this ritual call us to action? Again, it's okay to be a little corny or cheesy, a little camp. And make sure whatever you do for both your opening and closing ritual, make sure it has some kind of connection or relevance to the work that you just did. So, examples. One thing you learn that you will take with you and apply, have them write it on a note card that they will post on their cubicle door or in their home door, home office. State one conversation you are now going to have as a result of this training. And one word, how are you feeling right now? That might seem familiar. We do that a lot in J response. Have a staff cheer or communal call to action. We will be safe at this J something or other. I'm not coming up with the right cheer at the moment, but you get the idea. A dance or a handshake, again, whatever you do, we are making it COVID friendly these days. So we went through the 10 pretty quickly. Some Q&A and discussion. What resonates with you? What is challenging you? And what else are you hoping to learn that you haven't that you haven't yet learned here? So I'm going to stop the share so I can see your faces. But I will put in the chat, for those that are here, everyone, what's resonating, what's challenging, what else do you want to learn? So you can put it in the chat, and I would also love for folks to unmute and kind of share what's resonating or what's challenging to this group for a few minutes before we continue and then close by the top of the hour.
I'll go, Mark. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hey, well, this might not be quite the time to ask this, but so I've been part of the J response since the beginning, and I'm feeling like there's more emphasis now on like lockdowns and being prepared. I'm not being very clear, but before it was more like a response to something that's already happened, and now it seems like we're talking more about being prepared, like doing drills and tabletop exercises. Am I correct? And
it's a good question. I would say yes, and we have not. Yes, and we are about all of those things. We are all still about how it was in the very beginning, that we have a group of people called J responders that should a JCC be in need and they're requested deployment, we're ready to deploy and respond, as it would be after a Hurricane Harvey or a Tree of Life synagogue shooting, or heaven forbid any of those things happen. And how might we, as a J response community, ensure that our JCCs are fully ready, so when crises hit, any damage that does occur and any lives or livelihoods that are impacted can be minimized, if not prevented or eliminated. The best response is readiness. Before, as J response started, and Leah was part of this journey before I was, readiness wasn't necessarily initially a part of the R's. We made it part of the R because we part of the R's because we realized that if we don't discuss readiness, then we're not doing our best job in responding. So the initial part is still very much there. And thankfully, even though we've had COVID over the last 20 months, we haven't yet realized the full-scale deployment yet. We have to prepare for it, whether it happens or not. In the meantime, how might we fulfill the why and the values of J response through the crisis preparation and doing this work, because we know that there's daily crises at our JCCs every day, whether we're deploying or not. Hope that addresses the question.
Yeah, that totally addresses it and makes sense. And to more specifically answer your query, my challenges right now are that we're so short-staffed. Even thinking of doing a tabletop, I can't do it. Like I had to cancel my safety meeting last week because nobody could take a break and come to the meeting.
Does I want to invite other comments that perhaps Bill had even before we spoke, but I also invite people if they want to respond to Joseph's challenge of how we do this work when we don't have the full staffing, or many of us may not have the full staffing as we did pre-COVID.
Does anybody else feel like you're constantly reinventing the wheel on how to just do your daily normal things? We still have people who are not comfortable inside. We have people who are not comfortable outside. We just how to go about doing things. I think that's just a frustration that I don't know if there's really even an answer to right now. Am I making any sense? Okay, I see nods. I feel better.
Does anybody want to comment on that? Because I can always comment on Jesse's comment as well.
Yeah, I mean, we're having to try to satisfy everybody, and it's more than it used to be. You don't just offer one thing. Now it's trying to please a lot of different needs.
Um, Many, if not most of you, or perhaps most of you, have been back at your JCC since shortly after COVID started. Um, the association has kind of more regularly been going back to the office. And I can imagine when you went back, or even as Jesse alluded to, like we're still kind of refiguring out our routines. That takes up a lot of energy. I think the goal of these conversations is how do we still make space, make holy space, if you will, for this type of discussions, for this type of crisis, because the natural disaster, the climate, the awful event is not going to not happen because we're preoccupied with navigating COVID. And that's not meant to scare us, that's meant to just keep us on alert. So, are there ways that we can fairly and calmly, if not more accessibly, incorporate these trainings or the discussions around readiness so we still have preparation? Maybe it's a smaller group, maybe it's something that is done virtually, and many of these tools and tips can be done virtually very well, in addition to or in place of in person. So though we have not as much slack, and though we're still reinventing the wheel every day or so it seems, how might we incorporate this into our cultures, or further incorporate this as much as we can? Because the crisis still might happen. And maybe there are 5 or 10 minute conversations to start. Maybe they're broken up. I see some comments coming in. I want to learn more about strategic picking of people for different trainings. Yes, how do you get people from maybe different departments or from certain departments, depending on the training you want to do? Pool readiness trainings with other Jewish organizations sometimes, yes, especially if you are in a smaller community. There's things that are unique to JCCs, and there are things that are not unique to JCCs. So it might be the Jewish organization, it might be the YMCA, it might be the United Way, it might be what are the relationships that you have that allow you to engage in certain trainings. Maybe it's the local police department or the local FEMA. Having people go to different trainings that, if we don't have the opportunity to train ourselves. Your job as J responders to make sure that you can get your folks trained. Doesn't always have to be us doing the training. So if there are other comments or questions, please keep them coming in the chat, or feel free to interrupt me. I want to add one more slide. We often bring in a Jewish text when we have these conversations. This should be a very familiar text because it's the text that Leah presents in the second module. And actually, Leah, after I share this text, I might give you the floor if you want to say anything. It's the Nishaterach Be'erev Shabbat Yochal B'Shabbat. Those of us that may celebrate Sabbath on the weekends. Someone who takes the trouble to prepare on the Sabbath Eve before Shabbat will have something to eat on Shabbat. If we take the time or the trouble, however difficult it might be, to prepare for the disaster, then we'll have what we need when disaster strikes, which is another why of doing these trainings, and may make those trainings stick a little bit more as well. Again, crisis won't wait, so how can you use these tools, however accessibly, to make them fit in your training work? Leah, do you want to add anything, just as my co-pilot in this readiness series?
So much has been, first of all, thank you, Mark, and hi, good evening from Israel. It is actually almost 9 p.m. Israel time, so almost time to say Laila Tov. So much has been said, so I'm not sure that there's much that I could add. I just want to echo Joseph's comment about, as he's been part of this from day one, and seeing the evolution of JResponse and the different components that were added. And someone had a comment in the chat how things keep evolved every day. I think that that's the challenge, the essence, but also the beauty of JResponse. And I think that as JResponders, and I know that Mark keeps talking about it all the time, keeping in mind the need to be flexible and to need to know how to adjust on the run, on the go. I mean, the word pivot was used through this pandemic more than I think ever. I know that I've never used it before the pandemic, and now we're pivoting all the time. So I think that that's one of the most important lessons that Mark is teaching us, that as J responders, that's the message. We need to know that pivoting is not, plan B, it's plan A. And I'm looking forward to keep learning with all of you. And thank you, Mark.